feeling about all of you listening.
Sometimes, a game will come along that, despite having such bad mechanics and being so utterly poorly optimized, it still manages to leave enough of a positive impression that I can look beyond its flaws and enjoy it as something that's more than the sum of its parts. I have my limits when it comes to bad mechanics, but generally speaking, I have a very high tolerance for jank, especially if it's offset by a really meaty story. I recognize that this is entirely a bias on my end, since I fully admit that I have a preference for games that focus on narrative rather than game mechanics. I'm a storytelling guy first and foremost. It's probably why I've got such a hard-on for RPGs, in all honesty. Call of Cthulhu: Dark Corners of the Earth is one of these games. In fact, in many ways it entirely exemplifies the concept of jank with a good story. It's a game that's buggy and crash-prone. Its action-oriented gameplay systems are, at their very best, mediocrely conceived of and implemented. It's unimpressive to look at, it has AI that's dumb as bricks, and it controls very awkwardly. But despite all of that, I think that it does enough things right to be a devilishly good horror ordeal, especially because its story was a pretty decent Lovecraftian experience, which is something of a rarity in this medium of entertainment. You see, there are a ton of games out there that either try to replicate the Cthulhu mythos for themselves, or they cite it as an inspiration and brand their projects as games with Lovecraftian elements in them. The problem with this is that many of these games, at least a lot of the ones that I've played, really miss the mark here. Lovecraftian horror is more than just spooky monsters that come from the edges of time and space or the inclusion of some sort of sanity meter. The reason sanity is so important to the mythos is precisely because it feeds off the feeling of hopelessness and utter despair that the characters put into these positions face. It's a tricky thing to translate into a video game, I admit, but it's a big reason why sanity is emphasized so heavily. It's not about playing tricks on your brain, it's about mental frailty in the face of oblivion. Now, most of that is represented fairly decently with varying degrees of success. However, what many games don't quite realize is that this brand of horror also has a heavy reliance on mystery and investigation. The reason that so many characters come to stare into the abyss is because they bring it upon themselves by delving into the forbidden knowledge of the cosmos. These are stories about grappling the unknown and coming to terms with the alien and the eldritch, all while hoping you can maintain your sanity just long enough so you don't succumb to the horrors, because the human brain literally cannot cope with the incomprehensible truths that you witness. Too many games that claim to be inspired by H.P. Lovecraft don't contextualize the monsters that they include as a part of a greater mystery that drives you to the brink of sheer madness. Which is a shame, because that's the part that makes these stories so scary. This is where Dark Corners of the Earth really does well for itself, because it manages to understand this concept and it runs with it fairly well. Admittedly, it falls off the cliff a little too fast for my liking, and it becomes its own antithesis during the later half of the game, but it nonetheless succeeds at integrating that layer of mystery, and even more importantly, that sense of investigation into itself throughout its entirety. Call of Cthulhu: Dark Corners of the Earth was developed by Headfirst Productions in 2005 for both the original Xbox and for PC. It's a bit of a weird game to classify. Andrew Brazier, one of the game's developers, called it a first-person horror adventure shooter, which, despite being a mouthful, actually does a decent job of describing it. It isn't quite a survival horror game, and it certainly leads far more towards being an FPS than anything else, but there's still a healthy amount of puzzle solving and item collection scattered about all over the course of the game's campaign. It's just a shame that it simply doesn't do enough adventuring and relies way too much on shooting. To the developers' credit, they do show a deep familiarity of the concepts and themes that are present in Lovecraft's work. It's well researched, and the team behind it demonstrate that they're pretty well versed in the source material. There are a lot of references to the literature of the Cthulhu mythos here, both direct and indirect, and if you're a big Lovecraft fan, like I am, it's pretty awesome to see. The inclusion of the great race of Yith is a fairly major plot point used to frame the rest of the game's story. Elder signs act as sanctuaries that ward off enemies that wander within eyeshot, and at one point in the game, you encounter a Shoggoth, arguably one of the most iconic of all of Lovecraft's creations. And of course, the entirety of the game's setting takes place directly in the city of Innsmouth, and your primary antagonists are the Esoteric Order of Dagon. In fact, almost all of the game's plot is directly taken from the Escape from Innsmouth scenario for the Call of Cthulhu tabletop role-playing game, which itself was written as a means to further expand on the mythos and go into further detail about the city, its inhabitants, and its significance to the greater lore. But there are also references that are a lot more hidden and require a deeper knowledge of Lovecraft's work to pick up on. For example, The body you run into in the beginning of the game, whose organs are all placed in jars but are still functioning, is a reference to his novella, The Whisperer in Darkness. Asenath Waith, the antagonist from The Thing on the Doorstep, has extended family in Innsmouth, though they're an invention of this game. And one character you find in a prison cell babbles incessantly about rats in the walls, a reference to Lovecraft's story, The Rats in the Walls. These are the sort of things that not only lend a lot of credibility to the game's developers, but it's designed to sucker people like me in. It's handcrafted for fans of the mythos to just get together and nerd out about. It's why it's really unfortunate that these moments peter off and they become few and far between the further you progress. The game begins so strongly. I mean, it nails down the atmosphere of what I expect from a Cthulhu game perfectly during its prologue and the first couple of in-game chapters. You go from investigating a cult and discovering their secret shrine to the great race of Yith, to losing your memory for 6 years and being admitted to Arkham Asylum, to combing over the city of Innsmouth looking for a missing person and trying to uncover why everybody is so standoffish and isn't so keen on you being there, to devolving into a generic first-person shooter? Don't get me wrong, the story is still satisfyingly Lovecraftian all around. The game is still abundant with those themes of despair and mystery that I was talking about before, and it doesn't lose sight of the bigger picture. But there is a stark change in pace following a dramatic, but still somewhat fun, escape sequence from Innsmouth. It's at that point that the game really tries to ignore that it's an adventure game and it doubles down on the shooting. Let me put it this way. When I sit down to play a game that's called Call of Cthulhu, the last thing I want to be doing is using a ship's cannon to shoot a great old one in the face during a boss fight sequence. Look, I get it. Combat and action sequences are very important things to include when you're making a video game. But the fact that Dark Corners has such an overemphasis on it at the expense of its more intricate and, frankly, more compelling adventure sequences really becomes its Achilles heel. The reason that combat works so well in a game like Silent Hill is because it's sparse, and, generally speaking, optional. You only need to fight enemies a few times, and every one of those instances are built to be tense moments. It's why the monsters in Silent Hill remain scary, and those in Call of Cthulhu don't. Dark Corners of the Earth changes from being a first-person adventure game with shooting and sneaking sections, into a first-person shooter with adventure and sneaking sections. Here, the tension should be ever present as you come into contact with Deep Ones and cultists and freaking Dagon and Hydra, but it's non-existent because fighting them has become so commonplace that any sort of fear associated with them becomes trivialized. No chapter exemplifies this more than A Dangerous Voyage, where after holding the line against wave after wave of Deep Ones spawned from the sea, you fight Dagon by dodging his attacks and manning a turret. And the only reason that moment even keeps you on edge is because it's a challenging encounter. This part right here would have been so much more interesting if they kept Dagon in the background and made him this unspeakable, unbeatable force of nature that you don't even get to lay eyes on. And the only way that you actually do defeat him is by maintaining your sanity and not succumbing to the pressure that he exerts on you from within the shadows. But instead, you shoot him in the face with a cannon.
It's a statue of Dagon, without the missile I lodged in his face.
Sneaking is technically an option for most encounters with your basic grunts on their patrol patterns, but it's so badly implemented that it may as well be cut from the game, and the game wouldn't be any worse for wear. And that's a strange thing to say, because sneaking should be the de facto reaction that anybody coming toe-to-toe with the entities of the Cthulhu mythos should take. The sneaking system here is so bare bones and restrictive though that it actually accidentally encourages you to rush in guns blazing, because by the time you get your hands on a weapon, sneaking is made entirely redundant. Your movement is slowed to a total crawl and your FOV is slightly increased to give you a wider view of enemy patrols, but it's such a negligible increase it doesn't make much of a difference. There's no means of knowing just how big the AI's cone of vision and sound radii are, which means that sneaking is more of a crapshoot than anything else. I'm still puzzled at some of the instances where I've been detected by these patrols, and the lack of any utility items like noisemakers or anything like that makes these sections incredibly repetitive and boring. And it's not like I was ever hurting for ammo when I was forced to sneak around enemies either. So given the two options, why not just shoot everybody up and not have to worry about it? I have a strong suspicion that Dark Corners of the Earth was a victim of marketing to an early Xbox audience. In order to have that mainstream appeal that it needed to succeed, the game really needed to look and play like other more familiar games that their potential consumer base was familiar with. So what you're left with is clunky gameplay with a limited assortment of weapons and constantly respawning enemies as a result of trying to cash into a popular trend. It's inoffensive, but it's also uninspired. Now that being said, one aspect of Dark Corners of the Earth that actually was inspired was the way that they handled their health system, even if it is to the detriment of the overall design philosophy of turning the game into a first-person shooter. See, the game is unique in that it doesn't have a HUD whatsoever. Ammo counts and your health and sanity levels are tallied on the inventory screen, along with your health items and journal entries. To heal damage, you can apply your medical supplies to specific body parts, and the game's protagonist, Jack, will start to patch himself up. During combat, you can see how badly injured you are by simply looking at the screen. The more damage you take, and the more strength you lose, the color of the screen disappears, eventually becoming entirely black and white until Jack passes out and dies. There's also other conditional effects like poison and bleeding that the game implements. Overall, this is a pretty neat thing to include, and I like the fact that the developers have gone to try and create a more realistic and grounded damage system. The game also has a sanity system in it, and it works in a similar manner. As you see more and more horrific things, you begin to get visual and audio cues that aren't dissimilar from the sanity effects in Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Jack's vision will blur or distort for a short while, or he'll hear voices whispering in his head.
I'm being followed. They'll get me. I want this to end.
In fact, if you take enough of a sanity loss in a short time frame, Jack may even commit suicide right there and then, turning his weapon on himself if you happen to have one equipped. This is a rare occurrence, but its inclusion feels very appropriate given the source material that it's working with. So the way that sanity and health works in this game is a fascinating system overall, and generally speaking I actually do like it a lot. And the two of them in tandem works really well to increase your level of immersion. But of course, there's a catch. While this system works great to punctuate the dangers that the Elder Things and their servants pose, both physically and mentally, it dampens combat a notch because it's an abstract system. Jack can bleed out, but you wouldn't know it until the color is more or less entirely gone from the screen. The shifts are so sudden that sometimes it fails to register just how dire the situation is when you're caught between a rock and a hard place. Make that worse when it's happening during combat and you're more or less screwed. Trying to fight monsters when your vision is blurred and you can't aim straight because you've just taken a massive sanity hit doesn't help matters either, as you can probably imagine. While these issues may seem like they're points in the stealth system's favor, the fact of the matter is that combat is still the better system, even with these detriments and the not so great hit detection. These may be issues with the combat engine, but the fact that it's still more functional than stealth still means that it's easier to go in and shoot things up than to try and sneak around them. Not to mention that the lack of a HUD also means that there's a lack of an ammo counter, at least a convenient one on screen, which means that you'll need to be counting your shots and manually reloading, all while trying to figure out if you've got enough health left to make a stand. And I mean manually reloading. If you try and fire your weapon while it's empty, Jack will just pull the trigger. He won't reload the gun by himself. Again, if shooting wasn't the focus and the majority of the game, these systems would have a much stronger impact on the overall narrative that the game is trying to deliver. The problem is that it's just another thing that makes the game tedious to play, chiefly because of where the game decides to put its focus. If it was still an adventure game or even a survival horror game, these elements would do so much to increase the game's overall tension. As it stands, they just make it a barely passable shooter with some great horror elements in it. Speaking of barely passable, the game is buggy, even with the unofficial patch installed over top of the replacement executable file. I don't think I've had a single game crash on me nearly as much as Dark Corners of the Earth did while I was capturing footage for this video. Skipping the cutscene leading up to the fight against Dagon had it play anyway, despite the fact that the fight had already started. I managed to get stuck here on the spike trap and not die, forcing me to load a previous save. And the ending cutscene glitched out on me and didn't want to play either the final audio dialogue or show me the final journal entry or my game stats. Not to mention on more than one occasion, the audio almost entirely was cut out and only came back after I reloaded the module. This, combined with the fact that the game had a tendency to not want to interact with the objects that I wanted it to interact with, means that there were problems even outside of combat that made it a slog to play. Stuff like trying to pick up items left on the world, opening and closing doors, and even interacting with plot-mandatory puzzles was harder to do than it should have been, all because I wasn't able to align myself the way the game precisely wanted me to. And yet, despite all of those issues, I still genuinely enjoyed playing through this game. Sure, I was frustrated at all the times I was trying to work my way through it due to the hurdles that it threw at me, But despite all of those setbacks, I still wanted to keep going forward and see where the game's story would take me. It's actually a well-told tale that hits upon all of the right notes in order to make it feel like an authentic Lovecraftian game. Plus, it manages to succeed at creating a strong sense of horror throughout its run, and while it's not anywhere near as scary as your classics of the genre, it does use its source material well enough to create some fairly disturbing images that I thought were worth a shock or two. Now that being said, the game suffers from some really bad exposition problems. I know I was just praising its narrative, and I honestly do stand by that, but while it manages to tell a really great overall story through some really awesome moments and some great environmental design, the game's dialogue is written pretty poorly. It feels sloppy and amateurish, mostly because the performances by the game's voice actors are pretty dreadful. They range from being confoundingly cartoonish so that the characters come off as caricatures.
You have my full gratitude, Walters. You'd make a first-rate agent. Too bad you got that stinking attitude.
To being so bored and unimpressed with all the things that they're seeing that the moment becomes comedic.
I can't be certain, but that looks like the remains of Agent Nelson. Just check the guest list. I'm under the section for fellas that ain't ugly freaks.
Back up! No!
She's dead. I'll be joining her if I don't get moving.
If the game has a saving grace here, it's that it has some really cool level layouts and some really memorable moments using those levels. I loved one sequence in particular where you had to grab this gemstone from under the eye of a Cthulhu statue. All the while his influence spread through the effigy, and the longer you stayed in the room, the more insane you got. Even though it was a shooting gallery, I really liked exploring the Marsh Refinery and trying to uncover what secrets lay in the lower levels. The payoff for that was great, by the way. Devil's Reef is a short and simple area, but its lore implications and its subtle use of environmental anecdotes made it one of my favorite places in the game. But out of all of the levels, the game truly shines the brightest during the opening sequences on the streets of Innsmouth, wherein you actually feel like an investigator who is slowly having the curtain pulled back to the unimaginable. That chapter is Cthulhu done right. And it's moments like these that redeem the game from its mechanical shoddiness and its expositionary blunders. In a lot of ways, Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth is a prime example of a failure of execution. Its mechanics are so badly implemented, it throws all sense of pacing out the window, and it's a fragile game that can be broken by being sneezed on. For all intents and purposes, it should be an utter disaster. But somehow, Dark Corners of the Earth manages to deliver an experience that transcends all of those issues. It does this chiefly by delivering a true Lovecraftian tale that is solid enough to make you forget about the problems that weigh it down. In fact, playing through the game is actually a lot like reading one of Lovecraft's own stories, because let's be real here, H.P. Lovecraft wasn't a very good writer. I love him to death, but that's the sad truth of it. His prose is pretentious, it stumbles around in its composition, and it can be very dry and grating to read. But at the end of the day, his works are as popular as they are because it has some really great ideas that makes me want to further explore his world. Dark Corners of the Earth is the same way. For all of its failings as a video game, and for all those individual components that really rub me the wrong way, it still has enough of a strong presence through its presentation that I can tolerate it because I wanted to see more. There were 2 planned sequels to this game, but they were both cancelled before they could be released due to Headfirst's inability to find a publisher and their subsequent bankruptcy. I'm genuinely curious in how they would have turned out, because I don't know if they would have been improvements on the groundwork laid out by Dark Corners of the Earth or not. For all I know, they could have fixed every single issue that I complained about in this video, but considering one of them was developed to be a co-op game, I'm not entirely certain about that. Still, it makes me wonder about it and lament, at least a little bit. But anyway, back to the game that was released. If I can sum up Dark Corners of the Earth in one word, that word would be confusion. It's confused whether it wants to be a straight-up first-person shooter or an adventure game with puzzle-solving elements. It's confused whether or not it wants to be something that's easily accessible or a little more hardcore. It's confused if it wants to be a horror game or an action game. And it's confused whether or not it wants to follow what's conventional and play it safe, or to boldly try something new at the risk of alienating a wide audience. The end result is this mishmash of systems that don't complement one another and make it more grating to play than it is enjoyable, for the larger part. The sanity and health aspects don't complement the shooting aspects don't complement the horror and the adventure and horror aspects don't complement the action sequences. And all of this confusion led the game to be released in a state that makes it highly unpolished in almost all of its aspects. It's a game that requires a lot of tweaking to get it to work even close to properly, and even then, that's just the stopgap. The game has bugs and glitches and other outstanding issues that will probably never get fixed, ultimately making it a marred experience from a technical point of view. But I'll be damned if it didn't have a story that got its hooks into me and didn't want to let go. I can't recommend Dark Corners of the Earth to everybody. It won't appeal to hardcore fans of shooters, it's outshined by other, much better horror games, and there isn't enough adventure here to appeal to the aficionados of the adventure genre. But if you're a diehard fan of the world of H.P. Lovecraft and want a story that manages to touch upon most of the elements that make his work so unique and compelling, or if you're the sort of person who can overlook a fundamentally bad game because you want to dive into a really good story, or if you're like me and you fit into both categories, then Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth may just be right up your alley. Just make sure to understand what you're getting into and don't expect a hidden gem here.